Today we're going to be looking at perhaps the most important concept to economists, that of efficiency. Ahead of equality, ahead of equity, ahead of justice, the concept of efficiency is paramount to the study of economics because of our goal of making the world a better place. If we are inefficient in our policies and decisions, that means that we are not operating in an optimal manner, and therefore we are not making the world the best possible place that it can be. We're going to take a look today at the related concepts of various efficiencies through the lens of economic efficiency in perfect competition, particularly in the long run. To understand economic efficiency, we must first understand allocative efficiency. To allocate, of course, means to distribute, and the notion behind allocative efficiency is that resources are being distributed appropriately within society. That is sometimes seen through the term socially optimal level of output. That is, we are not underallocating, we are not overallocating. If we were to underallocate resources, society wouldn't produce enough of the goods that they want to maximize benefit. And of course, if we were to overallocate resources, that means that society is putting too many resources towards the production of a particular good to its detriment. It would be wasteful, and society could use those resources towards better use in another fashion. The rule for allocative efficiency is marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. And if we keep those terms in mind, it's easy to understand how socially optimal relates to the concept of allocative efficiency. As is frequently the case in economics, it's useful to examine a graphical model to understand the larger concept. So today we look at a simple supply and demand graph of a perfectly competitive industry. And it's important to understand more than two intersecting lines here. We need to understand what supply represents and what demand represents. We'll begin with supply. It's useful to recognize that the industry supply curve is actually the sum of individual marginal cost curves of the perfectly competitive firms. So each firm has a marginal cost curve that is upward sloping. Recall, kind of looks like our Nike swoosh here, and that this marginal cost curve above the average variable cost is representing the individual firm's supply curve. So if we take all of the individual firms' supply curves and add them up, that is going to derive the supply curve of the entire industry. Therefore, if the sum of marginal cost curves of all of the firms within society producing a particular good must also be considered the marginal social cost to society of producing that good. So at any point along the supply curve, we can see that for a given quantity, the cost to society of producing that individual good will be represented along the supply curve. Similarly, we must understand that the demand curve is more than a downward sloping line. The demand curve is derived from taking all of the individual demand curves from people throughout society. And it's useful to remember that individual demand curves are a function of diminishing marginal utility, such that the more you have of something, the less marginal utility you will get from one more item. So if we add up all of the individual demand curves within society to determine the market demand, it's also worth noting that the sum of individual demand curves within society will equal the marginal social benefit. That is, this demand curve is showing how much social benefit, how much society is enjoying the production of a particular good. Anywhere along that demand curve, we can determine that. So we can see then that this equilibrium here is far more than just an intersection of 2 points. This represents the position where the marginal social cost to society is equal to the marginal social benefit to society. So if we were to take a look at any other quantity other than our equilibrium quantity, we'll notice that we're going to have some difficulties associated with that. For example, if we were to produce at some quantity greater than the equilibrium quantity, the cost to society would exceed the benefit to society, and we would have a deadweight loss on the production of that good, and all goods actually greater than the equilibrium quantity. So if there is an over-allocation of resources, we are going to subtract from the benefit to society by the amount of which the social cost exceeds the social benefit, so that society is not allocatively efficient. Similarly, if society were to produce a quantity of goods less than the equilibrium quantity, we would notice that we would also have an allocative inefficiency take place, that we would again have deadweight loss because we are losing out on goods that could have been produced between Qx and Q1, where the marginal benefit to society was greater than the marginal cost to society. So if we were to stop producing too early, we're going to lose out on the potential net benefit from goods that provide more marginal benefit than marginal cost. So if we produce at Qx, we are now under allocating, we are not putting enough resources towards production, and therefore we will similarly have a deadweight loss at that quantity. It's worth noting here that the only quantity that doesn't result in a deadweight loss is our equilibrium quantity. And that basically defines our concept of allocatively efficient, that when the marginal social cost equals the marginal social benefit, at this point, this quantity of goods represents the optimal allocation of resources to society. We are actually maximizing the sum of consumer and producer surplus at this quantity. Any quantity less than the equilibrium quantity will result in a deadweight loss, and any quantity greater than the equilibrium quantity will result in another deadweight loss. So the only point that is going to maximize the benefit to society, that is to be socially optimal, is going to be the equilibrium quantity, where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit, and we can easily identify that where supply equals demand. Let's now turn our attention to a different concept. Rather than talking about the efficient allocation of resources, we're going to talk about effectively or efficiently using the resources that we have. That is, we're going to examine the concept of productive efficiency. And simply put, productive efficiency is simply asking, are goods being manufactured at the lowest possible cost? Is there a cheaper way to make the goods that you're making? If the answer to that question is yes, then we are not being productively efficient. So of course there's only one point that is going to provide the lowest possible cost for producing a good, that is the minimum of the average total cost curve. And it's worth noting that the minimum of average total cost can only take place when the marginal cost intersects the average total cost. Because if the marginal cost is less than average total cost, it's decreasing. If the marginal cost is greater than average total cost is increasing. So the intersection of those two results in the minimum of average total cost. If we are producing at the point where average total costs are minimized, then we can say that we're being productively efficient. Again, let's turn our attention to a graphical model to help explain that. Here we have a perfectly competitive firm at the break-even point. That is, it is producing at a quantity where its best possible option, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, is going to result in zero economic profit. Because there's zero economic profit, that also means that no firms want to enter the industry and no firms want to leave the industry, such that this graph represents a perfectly competitive firm in the long-run equilibrium. And what's very powerful about this is the notion that at the profit maximizing point for the firm, we see that where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, at this quantity, they're going to maximize their profit. That does not speak to the efficiency of this. What's noteworthy, though, is that at this long-run equilibrium point, this profit maximizing quantity coincides with the lowest point of the average total cost curve where the marginal cost intersects it. To produce any other quantity would result in a higher average total cost, which means that you're producing in a way that is not productively efficient. So Q1, represented here, is the lowest point on the average total cost curve, and therefore represents productive efficiency. This leads us to our last, but most important topic of economic efficiency. Economic efficiency is the high point, the holiest of holies in the terms of economics. You are producing at the allocatively efficient level of output and the productively efficient level of output simultaneously. So, in other words, you are producing the exact right number of goods that society wants at the lowest cost possible. There's no cheaper way of making these goods, and these goods are the goods society wants and the exact right number of goods that society wants. What is worth noting is that economic efficiency takes place naturally. It's the natural consequence of the perfectly competitive industry in long-run equilibrium. That point is the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of arguments for free market economists, that the perfectly competitive industry will result in the exact right number of goods being produced at the lowest possible cost with zero interference or direction from the government. And it is the individual ambition of firms trying to achieve their profit maximizing quantity that is going to result in this long-run equilibrium. And in fact, that if the government were to make any changes to this market in the long-run equilibrium, it would result in a suboptimal outcome. It's worth noting once more at the end that this economic efficiency is not equality, it is not justice, it is not equity. Those things are separate from economic efficiency, and they're also very important, but in the minds of economists, not as important as economic efficiency. That, of course, is a point that's subject to debate. I hope you found this useful, and once again, if you have any questions, feel free to see me after class or during extra help.